Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, as part of my ongoing series looking at Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're talking about amulets. Now, it's becoming a bit of a running joke on the channel that every time I talk about a new item slot, I say, this is the most important item slot in the game, and here's why. So I'm going to do that again. Amulets are a very important item slot. They don't have the raw power of some of the other item slots, though there are still some amulets that are incredibly powerful. But amulets as a whole allow you to patch weaknesses in your build, because they offer things that are often not available to certain characters or certain character combinations. And with your amulet slot, you can fix that issue. That means that a wider array of characters are possible if you know the availability of amulets and which ones will help your character achieve that goal. So it's worth looking at them, of course, because that can enable more different, interesting, and more powerful builds because you have the power of amulets on your side. Just as with my other item tier lists, I'll be going through these amulets in the order in which you can access them in the game by act, and rating them based on their power level relative to the other options available when you get them. Because it doesn't really make sense to directly compare an Act 1 item to an Act 3 item, since they show up at different parts of the game. That means that as we go through, on average, the items further to the right will be more powerful, because they show up later in the game, in absolute terms, but where they show up in the tiers is whether or not you should equip them. In S tier, I'm placing items that are best in slot for a wide variety of builds or specific very powerful builds. In A tier, items that make interesting alternatives to the S tier items and will show up in certain builds or in certain party compositions. In B tier, items that are a little more narrow in scope, but enable maybe off-meta strategies or show up in certain very particular party compositions. In C tier, items that do have a use, but that most parties won't need to pay attention to because that use is very marginal, very narrow, or very specific to a particularly unusual playstyle or party setup. And in D tier, items that most parties can safely ignore and either sell to merchants or feed to Gale. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Ken Porter for the $5 donation, Paragon CA for the $10, Stephen Mullinax for the $2 donation, and Obamaclat and Paragon CA again for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's start rating amulets. We'll start with a nice easy one. Amulets. This is just all the non-magical amulets in the game. There's a wide variety of these, and unless they're marked as a story item, you can safely ignore them or sell them. They're just loot because they have no mechanical effect. D tier. The Dog Collar. This is the one that shows up in Act 1, not the ones that show up in Act 3 in the city. And it's a story item, though it's not marked as such. It just gives you a little bit of additional flavor when you're running around the world. This is part of one of my favorite story events in the entire game, but aside from just being poignant and emotionally moving, it doesn't have a particular mechanical use. You can get a little bit of camp supplies from it, but you're not going to wear it, so D tier. The Aberration Hunter's Amulet. The Aberration Hunter's Amulet lets you, as a bonus action, gain advantage on your attack rolls against aberrations for 3 turns. So you can activate it as a bonus action, you gain a buff, you just gain advantage on all your attack rolls against any kind of aberration. Also, if you're a Githyanki, you have advantage on intelligence saving throws, and aberrations have disadvantage on attack rolls against you. Being able to disguise self as a Githyanki will allow you to access both halves of this effect, even if you're not actually playing as one. So, for certain encounters where you're fighting against a group of aberrations, you can use this to gain advantage on attack rolls and disadvantage on all attack rolls against you, as well as advantage on intelligence saving throws, which aberrations will sometimes make you make. Aberrations are actually more common in later acts, so when you get this amulet, it won't immediately necessarily be useful, but this is a great one to keep in mind for certain encounters, because advantage on attack rolls and disadvantage on all attack rolls against you as a bonus action for 3 turns, that's a really powerful effect. That's one of the easier ways to just gain constant permanent advantage, and that's really good, because hitting your attacks is good, and enemies not hitting their attacks surprise, surprise, that's also good. So the Aberration Hunter's Amulet, while very narrow in its uses, because obviously it's only useful in certain encounters, is a very powerful effect for those encounters, and is actually worth keeping around, provided you don't mind microing your items when you're going into specific encounters, in order to gain the benefits of this item. You can activate it before combat starts, but it's also a bonus action, so if you forget, you can just activate it whenever, and passively, and it gives you a bunch of good defensive options, gives you a bunch of great offensive options, very solid for the encounters that it's good in. B tier for the Aberration Hunter's Amulet, because obviously you won't use it when you're not fighting aberrations, but if you are, then it's very good. The Absolute's Talisman. This lets you cast Aid once per long rest for an additional 5 maximum hit points, but it only works on yourself. It doesn't work on your whole party, so only the wearer can activate Aid, and you get 5 additional hit points. You also, if you have the Absolute Brand, which you get through a story event, gain advantage on death saving throws, which only matters if you're down and an ally can't pick you up. So you can pretty safely ignore that condition. The question is Aid on just the wearer worth it once per day? The answer, I think, is basically no. You should be able to get aid from another source if that's something that your party is interested in. You can use a camp caster for it, or just have another party member cast aid. And wearing this amulet in order to use the effect is just not particularly useful. You can swap it in and out to gain the maximum hit points and then take it off, but overall I don't think that this is worth it because it doesn't stack with the actual aid spell, which is a much better source of this effect. I'm going to put it in C tier because technically it does have a use. 5 extra hit points in the early game can be helpful sometimes, but for the most part you can safely ignore this item. The Amulet of Branding. The Amulet of Branding gives you, as a bonus action, you can make an enemy vulnerable to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. And that is an or, you have to choose which one when you activate the amulet. This is available once per long rest. It's a bonus action, and it lasts for 3 turns, but also goes away as soon as the enemy takes a damage of that instance. 3 turns of vulnerability sounds amazing, but the fact that it only works for 1 damage instance does hold this item back a bit. That being said, this is still a powerful option. A bonus action for vulnerability on a specific powerful attack can often, in the early game, be plus 30 damage or so. And it's worth noting that this works for a single damage instance, and the way that a single attack, so the way the game calculates whether it applies or not is whether it was 1 attack used to make these strikes. So if you have dual wielding turned on, they'll have vulnerability against both the main hand and offhand attack. If you use like a sword bard double shot with slashing flourish, they'll have vulnerability against both shots, with the Amulet of Branding. So you can kind of double dip on the vulnerability and do quite a bit of extra damage. Obviously, it's only available once per long rest, and it only applies to the physical damage portions of your attacks. So if you have a bunch of extra damage on top of that, then that will not get doubled. But doubling, let's say, a sharpshooter archery attack from a swords bard can be plus 30 damage, or plus 40 damage, depending on exactly what point you fire it on a single turn, which for a bonus action is pretty darn solid. Since you can only use this once per day, you're not going to keep it on all the time. You'll swap it in for an encounter where you really want to burst down an enemy and know you have an attack that's going to take good advantage of this. But the Amulet of Branding is very solid for burning down dangerous enemies quickly. It's going to go in B tier, but this is another one like the Aberration Hunter's Amulet that you should keep in mind and swap in when appropriate. The Amulet of Misty Step. The Amulet of Misty Step gives you Misty Step. Once per short rest, you can cast Misty Step when you have this amulet equipped. Once per short rest is usually how often you might need to cast Misty Step, because it's useful for repositioning, escaping, getting on top of dangerous enemies. I say this very frequently in my character builds, but Misty Step is the best positioning tool in the game, and every character should strive to have access to it somewhere, whether that be through a scroll, amulet, knowing the spell, having it on an item. And the Amulet of Misty Step is an important component in that goal. You will be able to you'll be able to acquire this amulet quite early in the game if you take path through Act 1 that gets you to the area where it spawns pretty easily, because it's not gated behind any super difficult encounters or anything like that. So the Amulet of Misty Step is acquirable relatively early and gives you a lot of flexibility, mobility, and power throughout the rest of the game. Misty Step is an amazing spell, and every party should try to have it on every character. By this point in the game, you may not yet have enough scrolls to keep a stack of them on everyone. You will eventually swap out your Misty Step gear for scrolls of Misty Step in the late game, once you have enough of them. But in the early game, the Amulet of Misty Step is great. It depends kind of on how early you acquire it exactly, because whether or not you have enough scrolls will determine whether you want to equip this item. But if you have a character that doesn't have Misty Step and don't have enough scrolls to pass around, the Amulet of Misty Step is awesome. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because it can patch a weakness, see what I did there, in your builds, by allowing you to gain a tool that you wouldn't otherwise have access to, and that's a very powerful thing, because it just makes more characters viable and more characters playable. The Amulet of Selune's Chosen. The Amulet of Selune's Chosen gives you a unique spell, only available from this amulet, called Selune's Dream, which lets you heal an ally for 1d8 hit points, and then they have to pass a Constitution saving throw, a DC 10 con save, or they fall asleep for 2 turns. This is only usable as an action, which means that you probably don't want to use it in combat, even if it didn't put your allies to sleep. And while a DC 10 Constitution save is pretty easily passed by most characters, even in the very early game, even like a 20% chance of your character falling asleep is devastating in combat, even if this was a good effect, which healing for 1d8 isn't. So the only real use of this amulet is to heal for 4.5 hit points on average when you're out of combat. And the game is so generous with healing potions and other sources of out-of-combat healing that you just never need to activate the Amulet of Selune's Chosen. This is a fiddly, annoying, and dangerous way to heal. It's unusable in combat, and out of combat it doesn't really justify the weight in your inventory. So this is one of the ones that you can let Gale slurp down like a strand of spaghetti, because the Amulet of Selune's Chosen is not good. D tier. The Amulet of Silvanus. The Amulet of Silvanus gives you Lesser Restoration once per short rest. This is pretty good, because Lesser Restoration's a situational spell that you don't want all the time, but when you want it, you really want it. It's one of those spells that's defensive and reactive, so it's not one that you would normally prepare in most caster spell preparation lists, although you sometimes can. But the ability to remove paralysis, poisoned, or blinded are all pretty good conditions to be able to just opt out of, especially paralysis, which can be incredibly dangerous if one of your party members gets hit by it. So having Lesser Restoration on a stick keeps your characters more flexible and also means that you have access to it even if you don't have a spellcaster capable of casting it in your party. It has special usage because in Baldur's Gate there's story events with Astarion's story, where you'll get the Bloodless condition, if you're following his romance path or just trying to ingratiate yourself with him, and the Lesser Restoration from the Amulet of Silvanus handily removes it without you having to spend any resources on that. So this both helps with a story event with a companion quest, and also is just a pretty solid option to have available, whether to swap in and use after combat if you got poisoned or something and just need to get rid of it, or to just have on a character if you are going into a combat where enemies can paralyze you, if there's hold person or something on the table, then having Lesser Restoration available can be really useful for breaking out of that. Is this one I would wear full time? No, but it does have some pretty reasonable uses, because it gives you a spell that you normally wouldn't have access to easily, and it gives it to you in a basically resource-free way. All you have to do is carry the amulet, and that's pretty nice. I'm going to give it B tier, because again, this is not a sort of full-time usage item. This is one that you're going to use when you need it in particular, but just like the others in B tier for the amulets, this is definitely worth keeping an eye on, and it's one that will also be quite useful in a lot of playthroughs, because it helps you out with Astarion's storyline. The Amulet of the Unworthy. The Amulet of the Unworthy gives you resistance to slashing damage, so you take half damage from slashing damage, and vulnerability to bludgeoning damage, so you take double from bludgeoning damage. Now, slashing damage is, in general, more common than bludgeoning damage. So overall, this gives you resistance to more damage instances than it's going to give you vulnerability to. But it is worth noting that, mathematically speaking, vulnerability is much worse for you than resistance is good for you. That's because when you have a damage instance, you're taking away half of it. So let's say you're getting 20 damage coming at you, you reduce the incoming damage by 10 if you're resistant to it, and you double the damage if you're vulnerable to it, so you increase it by 20. So the doubling is always going to be more incoming damage than the reduction reduces. So you really have to use this. You can't just equip this all the time, because if you get hit by bludgeoning damage, and it's also worth noting that a lot of enemies can do incidental bludgeoning damage by like pushing you off of ledges or throwing stuff at you, then you're going to take double, and that's pretty dangerous. That said, there are a lot of encounters where there is slashing damage and there is no bludgeoning damage. And even in general, there's a lot more slashing damage in the game than there is bludgeoning damage sort of overall. So the Amulet of the Unworthy can really come in handy for certain encounters and be pretty powerful. It's actually such a good effect, just permanent resistance to slashing damage, that it's very much worth keeping in mind. Obviously, you only want this if you're not using the buff on heal items that just give you permanent blade ward when you heal your allies. But for a lot of characters, if you aren't using that item set, the Hellrider's Pride, then gaining resistance to slashing damage can be very instrumental in keeping them alive. Also, because Hellrider's Pride no longer buffs the wearer, the healer can actually use the Amulet of the Unworthy to gain a relevant physical damage resistance while still providing Blade Ward to all of their allies. For that reason, it's going to come in some encounters, and again, is just very powerful and very pivotal in certain encounters. Depending on your party composition, you may not use it, and also, don't use it unless you are pretty confident that the encounter is not going to contain bludgeoning damage worth speaking of, because if you do get hit by an unexpected Great Club, then your character is going to pop like a balloon when you're wearing this. So use this at your own risk, but do use it because it is a very powerful effect. B tier for the Amulet of the Unworthy, again, comes in certain encounters. The Beastmaster's Chain. The Beastmaster Chain gives you Animal Friendship once per long rest. Animal Friendship is Charm Person for animals, so it works on animals instead of humanoids, and it prevents that animal from attacking the caster and gives you advantage on conversation checks when talking to that animal. Now, Speak with Animals basically auto-passes almost every dialogue check that you might have with an animal already, so you don't really need Animal Friendship to gain advantage on those dialogue checks, because in order to roll the dialogue checks, you have to cast Speak with Animals in the first place, and then often just being able to speak to the animal solves that encounter by itself without having to actually make a skill check for it. And preventing the animal from attacking just the caster, this is only going to be useful in very, very few encounters in Baldur's Gate. There's not a lot of fights against animals, and they are not particularly difficult fights. And then even if you land this, which is by no means certain, because it is a targeted spell, they have a wisdom saving throw against it. Though animals will tend to have a low wisdom save, but still, they might pass it. Then it only prevents them from attacking the caster. They can still just attack the rest of your party freely. This is a bad spell, an extremely weak spell. It's so situational that there is no situation in Baldur's Gate 3 where you actually want it. So it's going to go in D tier, just because even though this provides you a resource-free spell cast, it's just not a spell you want to cast. So D tier. The Broodmother's Revenge. The Broodmother's Revenge gives you, whenever the wearer's healed, they gain a weapon coating that deals an additional d6 poison damage. So basically, it coats your weapon, it will replace any weapon coatings that are currently on your weapon. So if you're trying to use an oil or another kind of poison, or if you've dipped it in fire, it's going to replace that weapon coating with the Broodmother's Revenge coating, and deal an additional d6 poison damage. 1d6 poison damage is better than most weapon coatings available at this point, and healing your characters is relatively free, especially in the early game. You can start off most encounters with this, because it doesn't matter if you're at full health when you get healed, you still get the Broodmother's Revenge stack. So an additional d6 poison damage to start off your encounters by dropping a healing potion at your feet and activating it is pretty good. If you're a character that has regular ways to heal themselves, it's even better, because you can consistently reactivate it. You can use the Poisoner's set alongside this and the robe and ring that give you additional healing and poison damage whenever you heal, poison enemies, and then constantly that poison enemies when you deal poison damage and heal you whenever you poison an enemy. So those three items will trigger in a loop in order to constantly reactivate the Broodmother's Revenge and poison enemies. But even without the Poisoner's set, the Broodmother's Revenge is actually just a solid amulet on its own. 1d6 additional damage on many of your attacks is a very powerful effect, and being able to activate that basically at will is pretty darn good. This does have some redundancy with carrying around like a candle and dipping your weapon in the candle or whatever in order to deal an additional d4 fire damage, but the Broodmother's Revenge does a d6 damage, and that's better. And since amulets don't have a lot of competition in the early game for ones that you want to wear all the time, I think it's very likely that some character in your party is going to end up wearing the Broodmother's Revenge, and it will end up being quite a lot of additional damage over the course of the game. You will want to replace this when you get stronger amulets, and you may swap it in and out depending on the encounter. But overall, this is a very solid piece of equipment that does a decent amount of additional damage. Additional damage is great, and it's free to trigger, so the Broodmother's Revenge is S tier. The Champion's Chain. The Champion's Chain lets you, once per long rest, imbue a character with a +2 bonus to intimidation checks for 10 turns. A +2 bonus to intimidation checks obviously is nice when you're trying to pass an intimidation check, but is not going to make or break most party face checks. It does help if there's a specific intimidation check that you know you want to pass, but intimidation is typically, except if you're a barbarian, the least used of the 3 conversational charisma skills. Because both deception and persuasion come up much more. Performance isn't typically used in conversation like that. So the Champion's Chain is going to be the least impactful bonus to a charisma skill that you can get, and it's situational, and it's only once per long rest. If this just gave you a passive +2 bonus to your charisma, or to your intimidation, then that would actually be pretty nice. Passive +2 bonus to your charisma would of course be awesome. But a passive +2 bonus to your intimidation would be pretty decent. But since it's activated, so you have to know in advance that you want to use it, it takes an action to use, the Champion's Chain is just not particularly something that you're going to be interested in. It is one of the types of items in Baldur's Gate that really reward memorizing the conversations in order to equip this item before going into that conversation, which I don't like from a conceptual standpoint. And I really think it should just be a passive benefit, but mostly it just isn't a particularly strong benefit. To make matters worse, it is exclusive with the Envoy's Amulet. They're directly opposed because they're rewarded for the same quest, and the Envoy's Amulet gives you a +2 to Persuasion, which is just way better in Baldur's Gate because Persuasion checks tend to matter more than Intimidation checks. The Champion's Chain, I think, is going to be in C tier because technically you can swap it in if you know there is an intimidation check that you really, really want to pass. But honestly, I think that's too much effort, and you're going to be better off and happier if you forget this item. The Envoy's Amulet. The Envoy's Amulet is the same as the Champion's Chain. Once per long rest, you can give an ally a +2 bonus for 10 turns, except in this case that the bonus is to Persuasion instead of to Intimidation. Depending on how you resolve the quest that they come from, you get one or the other, so you can never have both. Persuasion in Baldur's Gate is definitely more important than Intimidation in most circumstances, and there are definitely some persuasion checks that are pretty impactful on your honor mode runs. There are some pretty difficult boss fights that you can skip or make significantly easier by passing associated persuasion checks, and so swapping in the Envoy's Amulet in order to boost your character's abilities before going into those very difficult persuasion checks can actually be a pretty valuable tool. +2 bonus isn't an incredible amount, but if you stack it with a bunch of other options, it can make even a relatively weak party face, like a character that doesn't have super high charisma. Maybe you're a paladin who's not using strength potions, so you only have 14 charisma and persuasion proficiency, and you just really want to juice it to make sure that you actually hit that number. Or if you're trying to do one of the really difficult persuasion checks available in the game, then the Envoy's Amulet can help you out. It is definitely better than the Champion's Chain. The question is it better enough to bump up from C to B tier? And I think the answer is that Persuasion is good enough and impactful enough in Baldur's Gate that the Envoy's Amulet actually is worthy of B tier, because you will swap it in for a couple encounters in the game, and it might make the difference between having to take an extremely difficult fight and potentially losing and not doing that. And that's a pretty powerful benefit for something that doesn't really cost you anything. Overall, not the most impactful B-tier amulet, but one that is, again, worth considering. Komira's Locket. Komira's Locket gives you Dancing Lights, castable at will. Once per turn, you can cast Dancing Lights, just like the cantrip. You summon a bunch of little balls of lights, and they light things up. Having sources of light in your party is actually pretty useful, and so having at-will Dancing Lights can be useful in some encounters if things are dark. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't care about lighting conditions as much as some other games, or even other games in the 5th edition rule set. If this was Solasta, Crown of the Magister, then Dancing Lights at Will would be much more powerful, because that game cares a lot about lighting conditions. Baldur's Gate is much more forgiving of trying to play characters without dark vision in dark areas. But still, being able to light the arena is pretty powerful. Dancing Lights also has a secret second use, which is that it counts as an object where you summon the lights, which means that it blocks vents. So if there are poison vents on the ground, or certain kinds of traps that vent gases, placing a Dancing Lights ball on top of them counts as an object on top of them and blocks that vent. So you can use it to bypass some dangerous trapped areas by spamming out Dancing Lights until you cover the vents, and can freely pass through them, or even fight in an area that normally would be difficult to fight in because of all the gases. So it can save you a lot of time spent carefully hurling urns and vases around in order to block all of the vents, because it just gives you a much more convenient way to do that. Between the fact that this gives you free light source whenever you need it, and the fact that it will allow you to bypass some traps, I actually think Komira's Locket is pretty good. It's easy to overlook this because it's just a cantrip, but the ability to cast a cantrip that you couldn't cast otherwise is pretty useful, and this saves you from having to take Dancing Light on a character, which many characters, Dancing Lights is like their 5th or 6th cantrip that they would want, so your party may not actually have one that's useful for it. I don't think every party's going to use it, but it's actually pretty usable, and so I'm going to give this A tier because Komira's Locket is a totally reasonable option that a lot of parties will end up dipping into if they don't have a source of Dancing Lights elsewhere. The Moondrop Pendant. The Moondrop Pendant gives you, when the wearer has 50% or fewer hit points, you don't provoke attacks of opportunity. So if you're at half health, you can freely move around the battlefield without provoking attacks of opportunity. When you're at 50% or less hit points is definitely when you want to avoid tanking an attack of opportunity, so that in and of itself is not terrible. And there are a bunch of characters that can benefit from this if they are trying to run away from enemies. The Moondrop Pendant is available relatively early, which means that you can equip it basically as one of your very first amulet choices. And while it's not a massive bonus to your character, it is going to be pretty relevant in a lot of fights, especially before you get other amulets. Although this isn't in and of itself the most impactful effect, the fact that you get this very, very early in the game, and it does have a pretty significant impact on certain characters who might be in danger if they take attacks of opportunity, the Moondrop Pendant is actually quite good, and you're definitely going to equip it as soon as you get it. I recommend putting this on warlocks and on clerics specifically, because the enemies will often move next to those characters and hit them. They probably have like Blade Ward and Armour of Agathis and other ways to defend themselves, so they can get below half hit points without dying, and then they might actually want to run away in some circumstances, and tend not to have amazing options for defending themselves from attacks of opportunity, so you can passively run away while still trying to accomplish something in the fight. Warlocks and archers in particular can benefit from this because they are going to be making ranged attacks, so this helps you make those without taking disadvantage. But somebody's always going to be wearing the Moondrop Pendant, so it's going to go in S tier because as soon as you get it, someone's going to put it on. Though, of course, this is another one that you're going to swap out relatively quickly once you get better passive benefits. The Necklace of Elemental Augmentation. The Necklace of Elemental Augmentation is funny, because it's one that's available either in Act 1 or in Act 3. You can get it in both places. And the Necklace of Elemental Augmentation gives, whenever your cantrips deal elemental damage, so acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder, you add your spellcasting modifier to the damage. So you can increase the damage of your Ray of Frost by your spellcasting modifier, of your Firebolt by your spellcasting modifier, etc. This is especially impactful for cold damage or lightning damage cantrips, but cold damage because Ray of Frost is the sort of gold standard damaging cantrip. Because enemies can often have the wet condition, especially if you're building your character around dealing cold damage, and so the Necklace of Elemental Augmentation will often add double your spellcasting modifier to the damage because enemies will be vulnerable to cold. This stacks with other sources of additional damage equal to your spellcasting modifier on cantrips, so it'll stack with, if you are a cold dragon sorcerer, a draconic sorcerer of cold, it'll stack with that effect for additional damage equal to your spellcasting modifier. If you're a level 10 evocation wizard, it'll stack with that. So it's one of the ways to build up some cantrips to doing pretty significant damage. You can build around Ray of Frost specifically to have like quickened Ray of Frost or twinned Ray of Frost that does somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40 damage per shot, and that ends up being a pretty powerful build for a sorcerer, just because Baldur's Gate, the wet condition is so powerful that dealing additional damage when you're firing cold damage shots is extremely impactful. At the time when you get this, though, even if you're not trying to build around the amulet, adding additional damage to your cantrips is still pretty relevant. Cantrips remain a reasonable action throughout the game, though this will depend a little bit on how often you rest. If you're like me and long rest pretty infrequently, then your spellcasters will often end up using cantrips, especially in the latter half of fights. If you long rest very frequently, then your spellcasters probably don't use cantrips that often, and so won't gain much benefit from this. This is an awesome item for spellcasters that are casting cantrips, in particular Ray of Frost casters, and obviously less awesome if you aren't, so it's really going to depend on how often you rest. I'm going to give this A tier because it's very, very good for a specific, very narrow build, and pretty decent for a lot of spellcasters if your party doesn't rest very often. I will say I personally use this item more than A tier levels, but different players may use it a different amount depending on how frequently you restore your spell slots. The Pearl of Power Amulet. The Pearl of Power Amulet, which it's funny that it's called the Pearl of Power Amulet because the item in Dungeons & Dragons is just called the Pearl of Power. I guess they just wanted to justify it taking up an amulet slot because they don't have attunement in Baldur's Gate 3, but that's kind of a tangent. The Pearl of Power Amulet lets you restore one of your spell slots up to 3rd level once per long rest. 3rd level spell slots in Act 1 are probably your single most valuable resource because that's the big power spike for spellcasters and is what's going to win you a lot of encounters. And even on into the late game, restoring your spell slots is incredibly potent and extremely useful. 3rd level spell slots can be Spirit Guardians, they can be Hunger of Hadar, they can be Sleet Storm, they can be Hypnotic Pattern, they can be Haste. 3rd level spell slots, they can be anything, they can even be a boat. So you are going to be using them a ton, and restoring them is very, very valuable. Again, you probably won't use this item if you long rest all the time, but even if you do, being able to restore your 3rd level spell slots to take one more encounter is pretty nice on in some scenarios, and you will also just be able to use this during combat if you happen to have a combat go unexpectedly long and you're out of powerful spells. It does take an action to activate, but if your spellcaster has nothing to do, sometimes activating the Pearl of Power and then casting a 3rd level spell next turn can be better than spending 2 turns casting cantrips. So don't forget that you can use this during combat. Typically you want to avoid doing that, but in an emergency it can absolutely be useful. Since this is a really powerful amount of longevity for your party and a very powerful resource available from an amulet, the Pearl of Power, of course, is going into S tier. This is going to be a mainstay for spellcasters basically throughout the entire game. The Periapt of Wound Closure. The Periapt of Wound Closure gives you, when your character's down, so when they're reduced to 0 hit points, they automatically stabilize at the start of their turn. This doesn't stop enemies from attacking and killing them anyways, which the AI in Baldur's Gate does like to confirm kills on downed characters, so this won't save your character in most circumstances, and is a pretty safe ability to ignore because it's easy to get allies up with potions, or the help action, or with Healing Word, which most of your parties should have available. But it also maximizes the value of any healing that you receive. So if you were to take a Healing Word, which heals for a D4, you would always get 4 hit points. Cure Wounds, which heals for a D8, you always get 8 hit points, and so on. This is pretty powerful, especially if you are doing sort of regular amounts of healing that in your party. And because it will allow you can also pass this around for out-of-combat healing in order to maximize your use of potions if you don't mind doing a little bit of fiddly micro in between your party members. For the most part, unless you have a party that is specifically built around doing a lot of healing and a character who's constantly taking a lot of damage, the Periapt of Wound Closure won't be a tremendous benefit for your party. But if you are in that circumstance, or if you just want to maximize your out-of-combat resources, then the Periapt of Wound Closure can be pretty useful. I don't think it's a massive enough bonus that you need to spend time microing the amulet from person to person before they drink potions. You can just drink another couple potions and then buy a few more. But the Periapt of Wound Closure does let you conserve resources and does power up some builds if you are looking to heal constantly. One other thing that this does is if you have a way to heal for random amounts yourself, like let's say you are stealing life on every attack using the Shattered Flail or the Sword of Chaos, the Periapt of Wound Closure will maximize those healing amounts, so you'll be healing a pretty consistent amount of... So you'll be healing a pretty high amount of healing and pretty consistent amount, which lets you predict your future turns better, because you'll know what your hit point levels will be at before you actually go to the turn. So overall, this has a bunch of minor uses. I don't think that it's one that you need to pay attention to, but it is a pretty reasonable and powerful option for a lot of parties. I'm going to give it B tier. Like with a lot of the amulets, it's somewhat situational, and it's one that you're going to want to swap in depending on your builds or depending on your encounter, whether you want to maximize resources or not. But again, very much worth paying attention to. The Psychic Spark. The Psychic Spark gives you Magic Missile once per long rest, and whenever you fire Magic Missile, you shoot an extra missile. So basically it raises the level of your Magic Missile by 1. So if you use a level 1 Magic Missile, you get a level 2 Magic Missile, and so on. Once per long rest Magic Missile is already not a terrible option for an amulet to have, or for an item to have, because you can swap it in, use it, and Magic Missile is a pretty good spell overall for confirming kills or just dealing guaranteed damage to an enemy that's hard to hit. And so the Psychic Spark has a lot of utility in that sense, and the fact that it gives you an additional missile is nice. It's not game-breaking or anything in the early game especially. But an additional missile means more low-health enemies that you can guarantee kill, and a higher threshold that you can guarantee killing a low-health enemy from. With one with 4 missiles, they each do a d4 plus 1 damage. That means you're guaranteed a minimum of 8 damage, and that's reaching the point where you can pretty reliably kill enemies one hit sooner than you would be able to otherwise. Because let's say an enemy has 50 hit points and your character's attacks do 20 damage, you hit them twice, and then you can basically guarantee finishing them off with a 4-shot magic missile, which you couldn't with a 3-shot magic missile. This lets you be much more efficient in your allocation of resources during combats, and so is a pretty powerful tool to have at your disposal, just powering up your a very good spell and giving you more casts of it. The Psychic Spark is also a core part of Magic Missile-specific builds, which are based around getting high-level Evocation Wizard bonuses to increase the damage of Magic Missile, and using items that increase the damage instances of Magic Missile, like the Hat of the Sharp Caster, and a bunch of other items that buff Magic Missile per missile, lightning charges, and so on. And obviously for those builds, the Psychic Spark is amazing. Overall, the Psychic Spark is going to be pretty powerful for a wide array of builds, and I would be surprised if you didn't want to equip it in the early game, just because Magic Missile is so valuable for some encounters, and so valuable for every encounter to have access to. Whether or not you use it in a given encounter, the availability of it just gives you so much safety and so much leeway for how you play an encounter that the Psychic Spark is excellent. So both for builds that are based around Magic Missile and for builds that just need a little bit of safety margin, the Psychic Spark is an S-tier amulet that you should equip somewhere in all of your parties, just because it's so valuable to have access to Magic Missile as a tool. The Sentient Amulet. The Sentient Amulet is sort of a story item. It's part of a quest, and it has an upgraded version that you can maybe get later in the game, the very rare version of the Sentient Amulet, but this is the rare blue version that you get in Act 1. The Sentient Amulet gives you Shatter, available once per short rest, and Key Restoration, allowing you to restore 2 spent key points if you're a monk, once per long rest. However, if you use the Shatter ability, and it's only the Shatter ability, not the Key Restoration ability, although the tooltip says triggers off the ability of the Sentient Amulet, which doesn't particularly help you determine what actually triggers it. If you use the Shatter ability, you have to make a DC 10 Wisdom save, or fall over laughing as though you were hit by Tasha's Hideous Laughter for 1 turn. There's also a story event that can increase the DC of that save to 15 from 10, which makes it much, much harder to pass. So once per short rest, Shatter is pretty useful. There's a lot of encounters in the game where Shatter is pretty nice, and it's a spell that a lot of characters don't actually want to take as a spell known, because it's only useful in some encounters, but having it on an item really helps. But the fact that it stuns you, it potentially is definitely a real downside. Now, a lot of the uses for Shatter are actually outside of combat, because you can kill the scrying orbs with it without starting an encounter. And so it doesn't really matter if you get Tasha's Hideous Laughter if you are not actually starting a combat. If you're not in combat, you can just wait out the duration. So for that reason, the Sentient Amulet is pretty good there. 2 additional key points also just increases the longevity of your monk, especially in the early game, and there's no penalty to this, but it does take an action, so you'll only use it outside of combat. But for a monk, it's pretty good. If your party doesn't have Shatter, or if you have a monk, the Sentient Amulet is definitely going to see play, either swapped in to restore some key points, or to allow you to break scrying orbs relatively safely. And so even though this seems like an item with a lot of downsides, and it's one that you don't want to use in combat, the Sentient Amulet is actually definitely a valuable tool to have in your arsenal, and I'm going to give it A tier, mainly for its usage for a monk. But don't forget that the Shatter usage for the outside of combat circumstance where you want to shatter the scrying orbs or break boxes or whatever is actually a pretty relevant part of this item as well. Alright, my friends, we still do have some Act 1 amulets remaining. There's still 7 Act 1 amulets remaining here, but I'm actually going to make the cut in the video here, because there are so many Act 1 amulets, and there are only 10 total Act 2 amulets. So rather than do one video that's like an hour and a half long and one that's only 25 minutes long, I'm going to just cut this tier list into parts, rather than dividing it strictly by act, just because the number of amulets available in each act is so lopsided, especially compared to other item slots. So I'm going to make the cut on the video here, but definitely check back in for the part 2 of this video, where we're going to finish off the Act 1 amulets and discuss all of the ones available in Act 2. As always, of course, if you think there's something that I'm missing so far, then definitely let me know in the comments. If you think that I should move any of these amulets around, please do let me know, because I do really appreciate hearing your thoughts on that, and I'm very open to moving items around if people have good arguments as to why they should go in a different tier, especially if you think there's a use case for an item that I'm just missing or not understanding, then definitely do let me know. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, please feel free to hit like and leave a comment. Helps me out with the algorithm, and YouTube does take audience engagement pretty heavily into account when it's deciding whether to show people videos or not, so taking a little moment to do that helps me and helps keep the Baldur's Gate scene alive. Of course, as always, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists, including part 2 and 3 of this Amulets tier list, and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends, and I'll catch you next time.